Hey everyone, it's Mike Huber, founder and CEO of the Freshman Foundation. Every high school athlete gets excited about finally arriving on campus. Becoming a collegiate athlete is the ultimate reward for all the sacrifices you've made for 10 plus years to get to this point. However, ask any athlete what it was like to make the leap to collegiate athletics, and they will tell you it is hard, and not only on the field. In private moments, high school student athletes might ask themselves, am I truly ready to make the leap to college? The parents might ask, is my child truly ready to handle life on their own in college? It is absolutely normal to ask these questions. However, that doesn't make you feel any better if you don't have the answers. What if you had a playbook to help you answer these questions before you arrive on campus? The Freshman Foundation Digital Playbook helps high school athletes be ready to dominate the leap to collegiate athletics. The Freshman Foundation is an interactive digital resource to help you prepare to answer the hard questions before you get to college. Your investment in the Freshman Foundation Playbook will help you avoid giving away your first year of college and will help your parents avoid losing sleep at night. Visit michaelvhuber.com/course to learn how you can be ready to dominate the leap to collegiate athletics. Now let's get on to the podcast.
Welcome to the Freshman Foundation Podcast, helping you make the jump from high school athletics to the collegiate level and beyond, with your host, Michael Huber.
What's holding Gen Z athletes back from building true confidence? Welcome to the Freshman Foundation Podcast, where we help young athletes become confident problem solvers in sport and life. In this episode, I sit down with David Durand, a mental performance coach with a background in clinical psychology, to discuss the unique challenges facing Generation Z athletes. David shares personal experiences as both an athlete and coach, offering strategies to build mental resilience in a world driven by external validation. Whether you're an athlete, coach, or parent, this episode is packed with practical tools and strategies to help Gen Z athletes build resilience and thrive under pressure. I'm excited for this conversation. Let's build your foundation with David Durand. Hey, David, how are you?
Doing well. Yeah, thanks for having me.
It's my pleasure to have you. Thanks for coming on to the podcast. So, to jump right in, I wanted to ask you, the first question is, what do you find to be the unique challenges of working with Generation Z?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, I can kind of go into some specific things and what the research says, but I think what's unique about my perspective too is I have my own personal experience because I'm right on the cusp. So when I'm talking, I'm sharing it from my own journey as an athlete and now being on, the coaching side, but then also working with Gen Z athletes. So for me, the unique challenges in my own life and then those I've been working with is, putting excessive pressure and stress on yourself as you're going through. I think there's so many unrealistic expectations nowadays that are completely exacerbated or even created by, social media or just media in general. This pressure to always look perfect, to be perfect, to perform perfect, because you can't make a mistake. You can't embarrass yourself because you're being, there's surveillance all the time. You're being watched all the time. You're being filmed all the time. And then people's attention spans, right, are getting more and more limited. And it's like everybody's kind of playing this game, fighting for attention and validation and acceptance. And you really have to prove yourself and do everything just right to get, your 10 seconds of fame, your 10 seconds of people's attention and validation. And so I experienced that in my own life. And, that was a unique challenge. Was I feel like as a child, I fell in love with sports, love sports. And then as I started getting into adolescence, your brain starts to change. You start to become more aware, and then you kind of start to become more self-conscious. But I know that being intensely insecure is just human nature, especially during adolescence. Adolescents are intensely insecure, especially around that 11, 12, 13, 14 years old. And, we tend to get more secure as we go, hopefully. But in my experience and then working with people now, social media really held me hostage in that like intense insecurity. I got an
Mhm.
iPhone, early on in high school. I had social media from middle school on, but Instagram and Snapchat and all these apps and all
Mhm.
these platforms, I just started to prioritize my own image, and I started to care less about just the love of the game, the passion for the game, learning and growing, the things that I really just like, hooked me
Mhm.
when I was a kid. It started to become less about that and more about just the appearances of things. And so, to sum
Mhm.
that all up, I think the biggest unique challenge, which has partly always been there, but now it's worse than ever for adolescents, for is the fact that they're more they're um, they're more concerned with their image because there's more pressure
Mhm.
and stress to look perfect than there has been in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, just to be totally clear here, Generation Z, I think, we know a lot of people know what that means and have heard that before. But just to be clear, my understanding of it is right now it would be any athlete anywhere or any person, young person from 12 or so to 27 would sort of be the age range of people that fall into that Generation Z category. Is that correct?
That's right. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. So I think, you said a lot of really important things, and I think it's great that you're talking about it and kind of sharing that perspective from your own point of view, because I'm very far removed from being being in at your stage of life, but I also have children who are Gen Z children, right? So, I see things a little bit differently. But one of the things I do notice in my work, certainly, and as a parent to a certain extent, is there is this element of perfectionism, I think, in every person in that sort of teenager age, certainly that I come across, where perfectionism, I think some people think of it as binary, 0 or
Hmm.
1, like I am or I'm not. But I don't really think of it that way at all. And I think the research backs that up, is sort of, it's more of a continuum, right? Like everybody has a little bit of an element of perfectionism. But the more I do this work, I think I see more kids have those sort of traits of like, I feel like I can't make a mistake, and that impacts their ability to perform and to show up in the
Right.
world, right? So like, what's your kind of, what's your perspective or what's your experience with sort of perfectionism as a coach and individually?
Absolutely. The two things that popped in my head just from understanding kind of the literature surrounding perfectionism, because my background and training is more in the clinical psych, so I always kind of have that lens
Mhm.
as I'm in the sports world as well. Two things that come up for me are social comparison and fear of negative evaluation. And so those are two things, right, that are completely heightened during adolescence, again, which is a feature of adolescence. It's totally normal. And there's, reasons behind that that maybe we can get to later. But as far as social comparison, they're always looking around to see where they
Mhm.
are in the pecking order. Where am I? Right? Because we're designed that you don't want to fall to the bottom, because then you're going to be left behind. You're going to be left out. So you want to at least be
Mhm.
in the middle, if not be on the top, and that that equates to quote unquote safety. I'm safe, I'm okay. And so we're always looking around, comparing ourselves to other people. And so yeah, perfectionism, again, to kind of bring back social media, when everything you're looking at, hundreds and thousands of images and videos per day,
Mhm.
and it's unrealistic. They appear perfect. It's not reality. There's edits and filters and highlight reels and all these things. There's no
Mhm.
blemishes. There's no imperfections. There's no people, just
Mhm.
tripping. There's no people missing that last second shot. It's just everything is a highlight. And so you're living your internal reality, which is completely insecure, unstable, not feeling good about yourself, and you're comparing that against people's external appearances, which is
Mhm.
everything is edited and filtered. And so that social comparison game, though that's natural, when you throw social media and kind of these unrealistic
Sure.
expectations into the picture, then that is a recipe for leading kind of more into depressive symptoms or anxiety and kind of that vicious cycle. And then the other one is fear of negative evaluation. I think that's also a big piece of perfectionism. For me, I wanted, I kind of referenced when I was a kid and fell in love with sports, in particular basketball. I wanted to be great. I fell in love with the process, and I just, right, you just naturally, everybody has a desire to be somebody, to really be something
Yeah.
great in life. But as I started going and then getting into adolescence, that desire to be somebody was overshadowed by the fear of being nobody. And I felt like
Yeah.
I started to live and play more from a place of insecurity and fear
Mhm.
rather than desire. And so I see that fear of negative valuation really pinning people into perfectionism, because, yeah, there's some elements of perfectionism, like, that's great. That can be part of your personality. That can really help
Yeah.
you achieve great things. That pushes you forward.
100%.
But when it's that desire to, just really be somebody, and you kind of have those doses of
Right.
perfectionism, like that can be fantastic. But when it comes from that fear of, and that
Hmm.
insecurity of, I'm so afraid of being nobody, and so I have to be perfect to be somebody. It's like, well, that's
Sure.
not true. That's, and when, that's what's pushing you forward, then that's going to be exhausting and lead to a lot of stress. So
Yeah.
those are kind of the two things that I think of.
Yeah. Right. I mean, what you're describing is right, is a road to burnout,
Hmm.
because we're seeking validation from sources externally that we can't control. Right. And no matter how hard we try, if we don't get that external validation, it's like, well, why am I doing this? Versus like, why am I doing this? Well, because I love it, because I want to get better.
Yeah.
Right. Because this is important to me. Right. And that's, I think, from an identity standpoint, working with young athletes and coaching, like that's a challenge, right? Like I think, intellectually they understand the idea, but like in practice, it's a lot harder,
Yeah.
in terms of like getting them to see things from that perspective. And that's kind of one of the reasons when I got into mental performance coaching, like I never thought that I would work with really, really young kids, like sort of on
Hmm.
that 12, that cusp of Gen Z, that 12-year-old, 11-year-old, 10-year-old. I just thought it was too young. I had this bias of like, why would anybody enter into that type of relationship? It's too soon. And then I took it on just to kind of give it a try, not to dismiss it out of hand. And I think what I've learned is that the sooner you can start to plant some of those seeds about the real basic, concepts in sports psychology of what do I control, what don't I control, right? What's important to me, like why do I do this? Like, yeah, obviously you've got to sort of operate at that level cognitively, but at the same time, it's like, yeah, you can plant those seeds where they start to look at the world a little bit differently at an earlier age. So you're sort of counterbalancing all the other stuff that you can't do anything about, which is social media is here and it's here to stay. Right.
Right.
And parents, as a parent, like I'm very challenged with that. Sure. I'd love it if my kids weren't on social media? 100%. But that's the world that they live in. Right. Like if I force them not to be on social media, then I have a whole nother set of issues. Right. But how do I teach them to operate within that construct of like, hey, this is healthy, this is not. Right. And
Right.
so that's kind of, I think, I feel like that's part of our jobs. And I kind of want to go back to something you said that I think is really important. And I think our difference in age is really reflective of this. When I was a high school athlete, sports were everything when I was a kid. Like it's the only thing I wanted to do. It's the only way I really measured my worth as a person 30 years ago. And there was nothing like this, right? Like
Hmm.
I was socially comparing myself to other people, and I was fear of being negatively evaluated, but I didn't
Hmm.
have social media. I didn't have this microscope. That's just, I think, a natural, like you said, insecurity is a natural human. That's the way the
Yeah.
brain works. That's the way we work. Now you add this other component in that just sort of like throws gasoline on that fire. And now we're living in a world where, that natural instinct to be insecure is sort of multiplied by, infinite amounts because of the comparisons that we see out in the world.
No, absolutely. Yeah, it is natural. It's natural, especially as you're 11, 12, 13, 14 years of age, for you to kind of be peeking over your shoulder, wondering who's watching you and kind of feel on
Mm-hmm.
edge and, have some anxiety. It's like you're entering a whole nother stage of development just cognitively, and you're becoming really like self-conscious at a higher level for kind of the first time. And you're becoming aware, oh, how's this shirt, feel on my body? Does it fit right? Or how do
Mm-hmm.
people, oh, I have acne? Like all these things are kind of starting to change, and we're becoming very self-critical of ourselves because we're becoming self-aware at just such a deeper level. And yeah, again, like
Mm-hmm.
that's normal and natural, but we're supposed to grow out of that. And I think that's what the beauty, in a way, that
Mm-hmm.
sports as a vehicle for development, for personal growth,
Mm-hmm.
can offer the youth, can offer anybody, whether you're a sixth grader or you're a 26-year-old professional athlete.
Mm-hmm.
Sports is a vehicle for developing an internal security that can
Mm-hmm.
be substantial enough to fight off external
Yes.
challenges and things. So to be able to develop that internal security, so you're not trying to get that security through external validation,
Mm-hmm.
and always you're just giving your power away, you're giving your agency away if you're always looking for that, if you're always giving control to your circumstances or your feelings or these things,
Mm-hmm.
or outcomes. Like that's just a dangerous game, and I don't think anybody wants to play that in the long term. So I think, again, that's the beauty
Yeah.
of sports. And to kind of bring that back to what you're saying is that nowadays, the focus is always to look good. And so rather than kind of 15, 16, 17 years old, you're developing this security.
Mm-hmm.
When I said earlier, social media really held me hostage. Now there's data to really bring that to life, especially on the
Mm-hmm.
neuroscience side and the brain development of teenagers, and how
Mm-hmm.
habitual checking of social media actually holds us, this is a paraphrase, but holds us kind of in that state of insecurity where we're still concerned so much at a really high level of what other people think about us and how we look,
Mm-hmm.
rather than, I know who I am. I'm developing some identity
Yes.
here. I don't need other people's judgments. Like, yeah, I do care because that's human, but I'm not letting that paralyze me. I'm not letting that burn me out. And that's
Yes.
supposed to be the natural progression. And that's my fear, is that people aren't aware that, oh, it's just social media. Yeah, it is. But if you're using it a lot and you're becoming dependent on that to create your identity, and that be a
Yeah.
source of external validation, then it's not just that that's bad. It's like, what is that taking away? That's taking away your natural progression of really becoming who you are and who you're called to be and who you're invited to be. And that's the
Mm-hmm.
opportunity cost that I see as the real danger.
Yeah. And so actually, it's funny, I think what you said is really important, right? The identity piece is just so critical. And I actually had this conversation yesterday about the connection between confidence and identity, right? We think of confidence, and obviously we can go get into the sources of confidence that a young person or anybody might experience in terms of where they get it from, right? But for me, confidence sustainably is really about knowing who you are as a person,
Mm,
right? What you value, what you're good at, like what you stand for. And so when those things happen externally, like you said, that we can't eradicate, they're going to be there. We know at the core of us, like, this is who I am. So even if I
yeah.
play poorly, I know who I am, right? It was
Yes.
just a bad day versus I'm a bad person.
Mm,
And I think a lot of young people don't go through that exercise, quite frankly, of like, what do I value? What are my core values, right? Who am I as a person? Why am I doing this? And I think it can be really challenging for somebody in that Gen Z age range to look at it that way, because it really does require some level of vulnerability of like, who
yeah.
am I? Like, what do I really stand for? Like, I don't want to know that. Like, it's just easier to like operate in this superficial world and not have
Right.
to sort of dig down and go like, okay, what am I all about?
Right. And having a guide too. Like, man, I wish I would
Yeah.
have had you when I was 11, 12 years old. Like, that's an amazing thing. Cause for me, I struggle with that so much. I thought, until like honestly, fairly recently to, have gotten to
Hmm.
the other side of this, I thought confidence just meant being sure of yourself. I thought it was
Right.
just a feeling. And I felt so unsure of myself no matter how much I practiced. And that's really why
Hmm.
I practiced and prepared and trained so much. I loved it. Yeah. But like, I was obsessed with practicing and preparing because I was trying to eradicate the insecurity of failing. Right. I
Right.
was I was trying to erase the possibility of failure. I mean, I couldn't do that, right? Nobody can do that.
Right.
And so it
No.
was an uphill battle. But for me, I thought confidence was feeling sure of myself, and I didn't feel sure of myself. So I was like, well, I guess I'm not confident. And I'm over here just thinking I'm a freak living in my own little internal world.
Hmm.
And then realizing like that's normal. Like every human
Yeah.
feels that. You should feel like an imposter. If you're doing something challenging and new and
Yeah.
uncertain, then yeah, you shouldn't feel sure of yourself. That's a good sign. That's fantastic. And so for me, realizing that confidence, coming from that Latin word confidere, meaning to trust, it's really exactly what you said,
Hmm.
like the ability to trust yourself. You have to trust and know who you are. There has to be something a little
Hmm.
bit deeper there at the core of you that you can tap into. Again, that's something substantial that can really weather the storms when, those waves are rocking and rolling, something you can anchor into and stay stable. And so, yeah, I love that idea of confidence and identity. I think they are
Yeah.
inextricably linked.
Yeah, and just to kind of talk about the work that we both do, right? You work with young people, I work with young people. We both have sort of a mental training background. You do some other things, and maybe we'll get into that in terms of like working with athletes on the sports side. But like, I think the word that came to mind, and you didn't use it, but you basically said it. If we use sort of more sports psychology language, is like you kind of build these buffers, right? Like these mediators of like, hey, the external world's going to be there. We can't do anything about it, but what do we do with ourselves to make sure that we can sort of push that away and ward it off when it tries to come in and kind of seep into the core of who we are? And I like what you said. I mean, obviously I take it as a compliment, but I think it's for any of us that work in this field. Like, I really do believe that to be true is we are buffers for young people, right? We're sort of starting to help them, think about things differently so that they can deal with the world around them the way it is, because it's not going to change. If we try to, this is my personal opinion, right? If we can try to change the system, and that's noble and it's great, but it's going to be really hard versus
Yeah.
how do I change the individual and help them think about things differently so that they have these buffers, they have that shield around them that says, hey, I know this is going on, but I can
Yeah.
look at it differently. I can accept it. I have something in my control that allows me to sort of redirect my attention to what can I do to make this a better situation versus, oh, I really wish that people on the outside recognize
Right.
me, knew me, like me, whatever. Right. And I feel like that's a huge responsibility for folks like us that do what we do, because I think, unfortunately, a lot of families, and I work mostly with young people, a lot of families feel that need to find somebody on the, a third party to help their kids understand that, because there's so many of these pressures in the world. Like you said, they're being held hostage, not only to social media, but just to this whole world of recruiting and all this stuff that goes on in the sports world. It's really, really challenging.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. It takes a village to raise a child, right? There's
Yeah, it
like so
does.
many, there's so many forces for good that we can bring in to really help our development, like ourselves first and foremost. And, if you're raising children, your students, your athletes, whatever role you are, but it's just like, we're formed by so many things. Why not, stack the cards in your favor, be able to pull people
Mm-hmm.
into that. And yeah, it's like we need people, especially if you're between the ages, of 10 and 18, you really need somebody to walk with you through this
Mm-hmm.
kind of stuff. And this is why, we talked about this. We're both very passionate about this. One, it's like
Yeah.
front load the work. We did it on the back end. We wish
Right.
this was the case. Like if now it's like, that's what's driving our mission to really help young people. It's just like,
Yes.
man, I know what it's like to do, later in life and have to undo so many things. Like if you set this straight when you're really
Mm-hmm.
starting and when you're going through this, like someone to walk with you in that, like we all want that. We all want a companion in it. And so, and
Yes.
just to highlight something, I'm working with a soccer player right now, high school soccer player,
Mm-hmm.
sophomore, and suffered a season-ending injury, and
Mm-hmm.
so his identity in a lot of ways is soccer, is as a soccer player, fantastic
Mm-hmm.
player. But now, right, he has all this teenage insecurity that's inside
Yeah.
of him that he's usually able to kind of push away because he's so good at soccer. And now he can't play. So that is kind of starting to take over a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And he's coming to this realization of like, man, like I want to be more than this. Like I don't just want to be the soccer player. Like I want to be
Mm-hmm.
who I am. And this is just something I do. And then he comes to the question, right? How do I do that? How do I step more into
Mm-hmm.
that? And so that way I'm able to really face these insecurities and accept them and
Mm-hmm.
deal with them rather than, having to keep pushing them back and, kind of, face it in that way and avoid it. And so, anyway, it's just interesting. I feel like that comes up
Yeah.
all the time. I had that in my own journey, and athletes are looking for a guide to walk with them because it's the big
Sure.
question, the $1 million question of how do I do that?
Yeah, and I want to just kind of stay with that example because I've been in that boat too as a mental performance coach working with athletes who are injured. And absolutely right, the fact that that young person was able to look at it and like kind of assess and go like, I want to be more than this, just this is incredible, right? That he was able to say, or she was able to say, hey, like this can't be everything. The other thing I have done and like to do a lot too is sort of highlight the character building elements and opportunity that comes through injury. Because if I can come through this experience out the other side, what does that say about me as a person? I'm pretty darn tough, right?
Right.
Now I've gotten through this. I can come back the other side of it and be even better. Not because I
Yes.
was, I was away from my sport and I'm scared that I'm going to get worse skill wise, or I'm going to get behind. But when I
Yeah.
come back, the other kids that I'm playing or players I'm playing against haven't been through what I've been
Yeah.
through, and I've been able to do it. Now, all of a sudden, you've got this element of mental toughness, if you want to call it, not my favorite term, but the best way
Right.
to
I'm
say
with
it
you.
from right now is come out the backside of it, be like, hey, I was through this. Like, I can do anything. Right. And I
Right.
think sometimes there's just that fear of missing out. Like, I'm away from this. This is going to really hurt me versus, hey, maybe I can use this to my advantage if I just look at it a certain way. And not the easiest thing
Yeah.
to try to get a
Yeah.
young person to do, or anybody to do for that matter. But if you can, it could be really, really long lasting. The effect can be very long lasting.
Absolutely, man. I love
Yeah.
that. And I faced so many injuries in my own journey. It's something I'm definitely passionate about. And so kind of going through this with that player and other players in the past,
Mm-hmm.
one of the book projects I'm working on is called Better Than Before. So it's a mental guide for injured athletes. And
Yep.
so that's, something I'm putting together. That
Cool.
idea of like better than before, like you're not just coming back and hopefully going to
Yes.
make it to where you were. The idea is to come back better than before. And I use the image of like, if you picture a bunch of athletes, like a whole team running around a track and everybody's trying to do as many laps as they can, and a coach
Mhm.
come and he pulls you out and he says, hey, you got to, stand over here. Everybody else is going to run. You're just going to be watching. Okay, that athlete can stand there and watch and just kind of count and be like, okay, everybody else's laps are going up and I'm not. And I'm
Mhm.
standing over here and everybody's getting in better shape and I'm not. And I'm standing over here. And it can do that and can get down. And then, when they're tossed back in, they're way behind. However, the athlete could also be like, hey, let me watch this. Like, how can I change my running form so I can be more efficient? What are
Mhm.
mistakes other people are making? What are they doing well that I can learn from? Hey, what exercises can I do that I don't get shin
Mhm.
splints so my body's more resilient?
Correct.
Or you know what? Hey, I'm dealing with boredom. Am I going to be dealing with boredom when I'm running? Yeah, you betcha. So why not get mentally stronger now in this,
Yeah.
arena, and then that'll transfer over to that. So it's like
Yes.
a totally different perspective of like, no, you're not standing still. You're still in the game. It just the game looks different. And so play this different game so that when you go back, you're actually
Yes.
better than
I
before. And
like
that
that.
kind of, just trying to change that perspective, yeah, is a challenge. But once they buy into that, it's different.
Very cool. I like that. So you mentioned you're working on a book project, but you also have a book that's out. Can you talk about the book that you have out there now?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's called Bet on It, a psychological approach to coaching Gen Z and beyond. And Bet is
Mhm.
an acronym for breath, eyes, and touch. And so
Yeah.
again, you and I are talking about the stress that Gen Z faces and just, a lot of dysregulation, a lot of just not being able to regulate their own emotions, their own thoughts, their own bodies and brains. And so trying to help with that through these three pathways: the breath, the eyes, and
Mhm.
the touch are three pathways that we can really regulate our energy, that we can really regulate our mood and how we're performing and just overall
Mhm.
health and well-being. So the first half of the book kind of takes a psychological approach to understanding Gen Z, so talking about things
Mhm.
like social media and how that's impacting them, but it also gives a framework for coaches and parents to understand these modern young athletes. And then the second part
Mhm.
is really kind of the practical tools part. So like practical tools through, breath, eyes, and touch that you can implement as a
Mhm.
parent, as a coach, to be able to help them reduce their stress, increase their ability to be, receptive to feedback, their ability to perform on the court, but also just their
Mhm.
ability to, feel better. So,
Yeah. So, I think I'm really interested in the acronym, right? I think
mhm.
so for me, the B part, the breathing, like that's a staple, right? Any time I work with a young athlete, obviously they've all been told, I ask them, how many times have you had someone tell you just take a deep breath? And,
Right,
they obviously say yes, but they don't really understand the why or the how, right? Which is
right.
something I think as mental performance coaches, we normally work on, right? This is how you do it. This is why you do it. This is what it does. This is how you apply it. But the other two, I'm more curious about. So tell me about the eyes and the touch. Like, what do athletes? What do you suggest athletes use in terms of their eyes and their touch to help regulate their nervous system and sort of be able to regulate their moods as they need to?
Sure. So with eyes, stress and vision are so intertwined. So when
Mm-hmm.
we become into a state of stress, of sympathetic arousal, and our
Mm-hmm.
hearts racing, our minds starting to race, our shoulders are raising,
Mm-hmm.
we're breathing more with our upper chest and out of our
Yep.
mouth, and whether it's in performance or you're just getting nervous before a game, whatever it is, we
Sure.
start to get tunnel vision. So what happens, right, is that our pupils dilate and our vision gets really narrow and focused. So we literally get
Mm-hmm.
tunnel vision. And I say that happens, biologically, like externally, but it also happens internally. We get real tunnel vision and stuck on things, and we're not able
Mm-hmm.
to be as flexible and as open as we would
Mm-hmm.
like, which, as we know, competition requires. It doesn't require you to be a
Yeah.
robot. It requires you to be adaptable and be able to tolerate, the uncertainty and deal with challenges and solve problems and make decisions. So you have to be
Yeah.
open and adaptable and fluid and flexible. So
Mm-hmm.
as an athlete, when you get stressed and you're really stressed and you're putting that pressure on yourself, you're not just hurting yourself on the inside, but literally your vision is limiting. And so you need to have a wider
Mm-hmm.
scope, especially think of like many sports, but even just like soccer, you're on the field, that's a big field. You got to have wide vision, right? You got to be able to not only have wide
Mm-hmm.
vision, but sometimes, yeah, you need to narrow it. So the key piece here is that when you're in a state of dysregulation, in a state of real stress, whether that be
Mm-hmm.
you're stressed and you're kind of, go, 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 and you're really anxious, or you're in shutdown and you're kind of just going through the motions and you're lethargic. When you're dysregulated, we have less control of that switch of being flexible, going back and forth. And so if I'm playing soccer, I want to look at the field, the whole field, and then I want to be able to zone in on a teammate for that pass, or I want to look at that whole field, and then I want to be able to look at where on the goal I'm trying to strike that ball. So we lose control of that, and we become really locked in. And so, eyes is really important to be able to get control of our eyes more, so that way we feel less stressed and we can perform better. And each of these pathways is bi-directional, so one impacts the other, right? They go both ways. So it's like I get stressed and that impacts my vision, but I can also do things with my eyes, which are the tools, and that'll impact the stress and that'll decrease the stress. So I love that bi-directional pathway, because it's not like it's a hopeless cause. Oh, I get stressed, now my vision's tanked. It's like, no, there's specific things we can do, and we can talk about maybe specific tools that athletes can do to be able to change it.
Well, I was gonna ask you that. I'm gonna ask you that question just in a second, and I agree with that. Right, that kind of goes both ways. But to me, for me, and we haven't really talked about this much, but that awareness, right, the ability to be self-aware enough to know that I'm getting that tunnel vision, that it's happening, is so critical. Right, that ability to recognize it and go, okay, I am stressed. My eyes are not. They're locked in on something that's too specific, or I'm fixating on something too much. Okay, now that I know it, now I need to do something different to modify, right? And so in terms of those things that you do with your eyes, what are maybe one or two examples of things that an athlete can do if they notice themselves getting too fixated on something visually? What could they do to sort of soften that?
Right. Yeah, so one thing specifically is called landscape or panoramic vision. And so we can do it right now as we're on air. But if you just kind of look ahead wherever you are, just look ahead like a spot in the room or a spot in the distance. And as you're, focusing your eyes forward, go ahead and just notice the panoramic, the periphery of your vision, the top as high as you can, the bottom as high as you can, and the sides as far as you can. And when you're holding your gaze forward in the center and you're noticing the top, the bottom, and the sides, that peripheral vision, then you're engaging in a relaxation response. And so you're switching from sympathetic to parasympathetic there. So that's a way, athletes, I like to do that with them. It kind of helps them re-enter that state of just kind of calm and composure, like halftime, end of quarters, timeouts, things like that. And then specifically you're in competition, say you notice, you're kind of doing that. One thing too that you can do is focus your eyes more on the open spaces in the court. I think as athletes, we get so fixated on where the defense is and where the people are. But once you start to really focus your eyes on the space, you don't see threats, you see opportunities. And so if I'm looking at the defender, I'm looking at this, which, is necessary sometimes, and there's specifics and there's nuance there for each sport and each athlete. But if you're focusing more of your vision on space, you're seeing opportunity. That's going to give you the green light. Now you're having more fun because you're excited to attack that space rather than to have to kind of defend yourself against, these opponents.
Yeah. So I think there's a couple things that are really awesome about what you just said there. Right. So one is I think about the applications outside of sport too. I just had a client of mine come to me who's in high school, he's getting ready to take the SATs, and he's having a hard time focusing on some of the reading comprehension. And so I was sort of giving him some tips on how to manage that stress. Right. And that visual piece is, I think, my hypothesis is that it's a huge part of it, right? You start to lock in on a paragraph and you're looking at specific words versus sort of seeing the big picture. That panoramic strategy could be something that is really valuable when you're taking a test. Hey, just reset your focus, right? Not widen it, and just engage that relaxation response rather than just staring at the paragraph over and over and over again, trying to find that answer. And I think that's hard sometimes, right? Whether it's in sport or otherwise, right? When we start to look at things that in our minds seem task irrelevant, we almost feel like we're doing something wrong versus hey, if I just take this next 10 seconds to recalibrate, it's actually going to help me on the next play versus oh, I can't take away my focus. The other thing that I think you just, you were saying about fixating on a target, right? On a object. It's so funny you say that, because I noticed that so much in soccer. Both my kids play soccer, and when kids are kicking the ball, they end up kicking it right at the keeper a lot of times, because that's sort of their focal point versus rather than looking at the keeper, am I looking at the upper right-hand corner,
Yeah.
looking at that empty space rather than fixating on like, oh, there's my target, I got to avoid it, rather than that's the target I want to hit and look at that target, right? And so like
Right.
we have a natural tendency, and I think there's a pretty fair amount of research out there on that particular topic, just in terms of why soccer players kick the ball right at the keeper, because like that's sort of like where they're putting their focus.
Right. And I love that. And it's important too, when you have time, like when I played soccer, I played defender. So you're in the back line, you got a lot of time to
Yeah.
like see the field and kind of
Scan.
wait and stuff, right? Scan. And scanning, a great word, like is important. And we need to be more exploratory with our vision, or else we're going to get locked into just like, specific pathways. And competition is creative. We need to be creative. We need to solve problems. We need to look ahead. So if you're scanning, right, and you're seeing the space, okay, but also you're scanning, oh, my teammate out there, he looks dead tired. What does that mean to me? That means that maybe he's not going to get back on defense the next couple of plays, and I needed to get my butt ready to cover for him, right? Or look, oh, I can tell like he's getting, the person on the other team is getting frustrated with their teammate. That's a weak spot. Let's attack that side of the field. Like just when you're scanning, you're getting information, and you get, I love using the eyes as an exit out of our head, because I was a player and an athlete that I would get so caught up in my head because I'm very analytical and I love to try and solve problems just by thinking through it. And being an athlete's really not about using the front of your brain. It's more about using the back of your brain and your instincts and just playing free. And so I love using the eyes as an exit out of your head, because I would realize that it's like when I was competing and I would get caught in my head, it's like I was there, but I wasn't really there. And if you're a coach, you really know what I'm talking about, or a parent, right? And your kid's eyes are just kind of glazed over, right? They're
Yep.
there, but they're not really present. They're not really engaged. It's like that's what I was doing. I was playing the game in my head rather than the game on the court, where I was trying to predetermine things before they had, okay, I'm going to do this, this, and this. And then that doesn't go as planned on domino one, and the rest of it just, falls down. And so really
Yeah.
helping people trust that instinct and build that confidence by like, hey, we can't plan and prepare, for every little thing that's going to happen, but we can build instincts and we can build that confidence so that you can trust yourself and, be dynamic in the game.
Yeah. And I have to admit, I'm gonna use that one,
Yeah.
eyes as an exit, right?
Yeah.
Out of your head. I love it. And because it's so true. Right. So I think that's a great way to explain it. I really appreciate that explanation, because like I think it's really valuable. Right. Because what you
Right.
described, I think, is what a lot of young athletes go through, is that they get the phrase, he's in his head. And the truth is they are
Right.
in their head, right? They're internally focused on, the result or what they're supposed to be doing versus playing the game out here. Now, sometimes you
Right.
got to come in right into your head and
Yep.
sort of have that sort of strategy part where you're kind of planning things out, but you got to know the right time to take it out and put it into the right place. And that takes practice shifting your focus. And I think that, that example about also noticing when a teammate may be a little bit gassed, like that takes a lot of awareness and a lot of like, okay, like I see that, I process it, I put it in the back of my, short-term memory, and then I go. Right. And so like, those are things I think a lot of athletes aren't coached on, and they're not
Yeah.
thinking about it. Right. And just to build
Right.
that awareness is a step forward.
Yeah.
So tell me about the last piece, the touch piece.
Yeah. So, the touch is huge, just because, the part of our brain, when we're talking physical touch, I mean, that's huge, right? Just for humans and the, research
Yeah.
and science behind attachment growing up and everything. But,
Sure.
touch is so big in regulating our emotions. The part of our, brain, the somatosensory cortex, which just really is a big key in how we process touch, is right there and really helps with our, emotion regulation. And, it can send some signals to the part of us that's kind of processing like fear and anxiety and things like that. So it can really dampen down the stress response. That's why, you hear things like grounding and, things like that. So that's why, especially in like the mental health, right? Like the poppets were so big, or just like the fidget spinners, like things like that, just to really get your hands on something helps you feel a little bit more here and present and less abstract and kind of floating and anxious. So I think it's huge, pre-game, during games, all the time, to really be engaging physical touch. It's also huge in team sports or non-team sports to really build a camaraderie. Like oxytocin is kind of the main molecule here, the main chemical that is released through physical touch, and that's a here and now chemical, which means it really builds bonds in the present moment, right? Dopamine is more of this like push forward, I want more, and I always feel like I have to do more type of thing. Oxytocin's more of like, I'm content, I'm here, it's building bonds in the present moment. And so that's really big, just to have that physical touch and to have those gestures. So it's
Mm-hmm.
not only, we not only as social creatures self-regulate, but we co-regulate. And so I think touch definitely has
Mm-hmm.
some implications for individual performance. Like, let's just take the example of a basketball player shooting a free throw. I'm going to incorporate all three of those, B, E, and T. So, like a deep breath to be able to settle their nervous system.
Mm-hmm.
Eyes, I'm going to fixate their eyes on a specific part, usually the back of the rim, so that they're aligned there. And then touch, I'm going to have them, take a moment to really like feel the ball in their hands and not just go through the
Mm-hmm.
motions. That's going to help them tune out the
Yes.
distractions of what's going on around them and engage like in their core of who they are in that present moment. And so now when we bring our minds, bring our attention, bring our awareness into our touch, we're dampening down the stress response. We're increasing our ability to connect with that present moment.
Mm-hmm. I love that. That's awesome. No, and I think that last piece, in that example with the basketball player, I think about this a lot is like, when you think of like any sort of mindfulness, right, activity,
Mm-hmm.
it's really about noticing, right? It's really about
Yeah.
really engaging with whatever it is you're doing, right? And if you're touching a basketball and you really have this like intimate familiarity with the sort of the texture and the way it
Yeah.
feels, and like you can be really immersed in that to be present as a tool and not think about all this other stuff that's going on around you, which you can't do anything about. And I think that that's a really
Absolutely.
good way to build a routine. Just use that framework of BET. I think that's really cool.
Right. And
Um,
just the sequence too of the
right.
BET, like you said earlier, there's times where you want to kind of come into yourself and like be present. And then like also, we know that we need to get out of ourselves and we need to play free and play by instinct. So yeah, breath is a good way. And even when we become kind of mindful of our breathing, we slow down. There's a part of our brain, more of that salience network, the insula, the
Mm-hmm.
anterior cingulate cortex, like all these parts that are more for just kind of
Mm-hmm.
being internal and noticing things. But then we need to be brought external. We have to externalize our attention. We don't want to get caught up in ourselves too much. So to be able to breathe and come into ourselves, find our center, anchor down, settle down, and then be able to go out through our eyes and then through our touch. Because if I'm using my eyes focused to the back of the rim, I'm noticing my touch. Okay, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
worried about my motion that I've practiced a million times. I don't need to think about that. I'm not worried about that fan yelling or that person, that
Mm-hmm.
opponent making a
Mm-hmm.
face at me or trash talking, whatever. It's like, no, I'm here. I'm with myself, and now I'm being brought into my next action. So I think it's the
Excellent.
order is important as well.
Excellent. So who did you write the book for, or what's the
Yeah.
practical application?
Yeah, so I wrote it for particularly high school coaches. I think this is good
Mm-hmm.
stuff. There's, at least a chapter in there for everybody, but,
Mm-hmm.
athletes, former athletes, parents, coaches, you can really pick up some educational things, and there are a lot of resources and references in the back. But for me, how this came about was I was working with two girls' high school volleyball teams.
Mm-hmm.
And the more I've watched high school volleyball, I've gotten into volleyball the past like 5, 6 years.
Mm-hmm.
I don't see I don't see the best team always winning. It's really the team that's maybe a little bit better at regulating their emotions and energy. And for me, it shows that, hey, well, if you can control kind of your stress response a little bit better and then stay together
Mm-hmm.
as a team, then that would be great. So I did two kind of camps. I call them combines because I combine the mental, the physical, and the sports performance pieces. And
Mm-hmm.
it was like a multi-day kind of combine camp for both these teams. And I was like, man, what am I going to call this? Like, how am I going to do this? And that kind of came to me of just like, oh, you know what? I think breathing's a big piece, and eyes and touch, and this can be a way to really help them regulate, because yeah, it's helping them as high school students. Just like on test, if you have
Mm-hmm.
pre-test anxiety, you can use the same tools. At
Yep.
home, boy drama, friend drama, like all the things, right?
Yep.
Like
You
you
got
can
it.
use these things to regulate. And so it's just like I'm all about that, like seeing the person behind the player. It's like, yeah, I want you to score more points in volleyball, but at someday, volleyball is not going to really matter that much, and you're
Mm-hmm.
going to have to give it up. And what did it teach you, and what did you learn that you can carry with you for the rest of your life? And I think that's really the value
Yeah.
is.
Awesome.
So to answer your question, then it's for coaches, because I'm also seeing that coaches that are really in it, the people, like we talked earlier, it's important for people to really help adolescents. But man, it's a tough job, right? If you're a parent of an adolescent, like that first and foremost. But I think high school teachers like really know that, and they can get burnt out pretty bad. And I think the
Sure.
ones that care the most and put the most time and energy are the ones that tend to get kind of burned the worst at times. And so I
Yeah.
see it as like a mission to really help them. Like if I can equip them with just some like tools
Yeah.
and knowledge, one, to change their approach so they're not always assuming things. Like we look at an adolescent rolling their eyes or coming to practice drained of
Mm,
energy, and we just assume that they're unwilling or unmotivated, but maybe there's more to the story there. So can we
yeah.
understand them, connect with them better, and then we
Love
get
it.
more return on our investment?
Yeah. So we haven't really touched on that at all, but I wrote that down as I was preparing. I think that understanding, right? That idea of, I just had this another conversation with another athlete that I work with. He's young. He's like a freshman in high school. But we were talking about school and his interaction, his relationship with his teachers. And I was trying to sort of explain them or at least help him see differently. Like sometimes teachers take things personally because they're human and because they have 30 students in a room or they have 100 students a day and they're always giving instructions and they're trying to help and they're trying to be their best, and then they don't get the feedback or the response that they're expecting, and that creates a frustration. And so when they don't give you what you want as an individual, it may not be because they don't like you or because
Mm-hmm.
they don't understand you. It's because maybe they've got all this other stuff going on and they can't separate either. And I think being able to give these kinds of tools to coaches is really important. I mean, listen, truthfully, I think we live in a world where not every coach wants to engage or
Right.
understand this stuff. They feel like, I don't need to, or my way works, whatever. And that's fine.
Mhm.
Like, I get it. It's a hard job and everybody's different and I don't do it.
Right.
But at the same time, there are coaches, I think, more and more, and parents out there who want to understand, what can I do to understand my young person better so that I can be there for them the best they can. And so I don't burn out or I don't
Right.
behave in a way that I don't like because of all these emotions in terms of trying to be really good at my job, because it's hard. And I think that understanding piece is such a big part of what we do, right?
Yeah.
Helping to make connections for everybody to say like, hey, can you kind of see it through the other person's eyes to make sense of it rather than just seeing it your way?
Right. And that's, I'm glad you said that, man, because I feel so wrong in that sometimes because everybody's about the practical tools or what can I do? And I get it. It's necessary. I'm here for it. I'm, trying to
Mm-hmm.
bring that as well. But like, I think at times that kind of just feeds that desire for like a quick fix or that desire to just take away the
Correct.
issue when it's like, these are human issues and they're here to stay. Like your anxiety can't be solved. Your human anxiety cannot be solved, but you can be
Correct.
helped, right? I can be helped. You can be helped. We can be brought into a more a balanced place and really grow in that. And so for me, it's like, man, if you can change and alter, yeah, if you can change the approach, like how a coach approaches an athlete,
Mm-hmm.
which the way to changing that is their own understanding and awareness of really what's going on behind the scenes, and really being able to step forward in a different way. And so for me, that's the value, is to change your approach, because and then that changes the dynamic, that changes the atmosphere, that changes the
100%.
relationship. And whether it's sports or anything in life, it's the relationship that's the most
Yes.
valuable thing that we're building here, and it's the relationship that over time is going to form us and change us as humans. So I think that's really what I like to hone in on, and that's why I put that part first in the book.
Yeah, I love it. So I'm going to segue into like the final question, the final segment,
Yeah.
but I'm going to use what we just talked about as a way to do that. So one of the most common questions I get from adults, from parents or coaches or whatever, is like, what advice would you, Mike, have for me as a mental performance coach? And it ties right into what you were just saying. My number one piece of advice, if I give it to anybody, is ask more questions, right? Rather than telling them what to do, especially if you're not telling them why they're doing it, ask them, try to understand where they're coming from, even if it's superficial or cursory, right? But just by virtue of asking that
Right.
question, it demonstrates a level of curiosity and respect for the young person where they start to say, oh, okay, this person is actually wants to understand what I have to say versus, no, I'm the grown up,
Yeah.
you're the kid, you need to go do this because I said so, which
Right.
doesn't work, right? If we know anything about, or if we know something about Gen Z, which, I've been
Right.
doing my researches, and I think this comes up a lot, is they want to know why. Why am I doing this? If you don't
Hmm.
explain to them why, they're not going to want to do it. If you ask them questions, now all of a sudden it seems like, hey, they're important, their opinion matters. And I think that for me is the number one piece of advice that I would give to an adult. So as we kind of segue, like, what's that one piece of advice you would give to anybody? Like, that's where I sort of like to end, is like, what's that one thing, right, you think is the most valuable thing you could share if you had to sort of boil it down?
Yeah, man.
I know it's hard.
But for me, it's like, I just want to piggyback off you, because it's like, it's ask questions, it's be with them. And I have like an example in the book, and can I share it real quick? It's just a little,
of course. Yeah, go ahead.
tidbit. And the image is, picture like an office building, and, there's a boss and there's a worker, and the worker, their printer broke. And so the boss is like going over to their little cubicle to tell them the printer's broken and they need to fix it because they need to print stuff. And as they're walking over there, the workers like gets up and they think the building's on fire. So they're frazzled and they're wide eyed and they're running out of the building. It's on fire, and they're yelling, and the boss stops them. And it's like, hey, like, we need this printer fixed. The building's not on fire. We need the printer fixed. Go fix the printer. And the worker looks at the boss like they're crazy, right? And so they sprint out the building, and then, they get nowhere. It's like they're on two different pages. And the boss thinks that the worker's crazy, and the worker thinks that the boss is pretty crazy. And then I equate that to how coaching and parenting can be a lot of times. We're coming at it as if it's like a logistical issue. It's an informational thing. And I always say, put regulation before information, because if they're not regulated, if you're not regulated, and you're coming at this, you're just putting defenses up, right? You're just kind of, playing rock'em sock'em robots. You're not actually getting anywhere. And so for me, it's put regulation before information. So if you take that same situation and, maybe the boss is like, the building's not on fire, this person's kind of crazy, but, I'm going to run out the building with them. They run out the building and they're, outside, and they're kind of breathing heavy from running. And then the worker's looking at it and doesn't see smoke, and kind of, it takes a minute, and then they're like, I guess there wasn't a fire. Maybe I just heard an alarm. I don't know. And then the boss is like, all right, well, let's, go back inside. And they kind of, chit chat and mosey back up inside and make sure that they're safe and secure. And it's like, hey, I know you said, you're trying to hit this metric for this month. Would love for you to be able to fix the printer so that we can kind of work towards that together. Like, would you be able to do that? That is a much different situation. Yes. That's going to be a much different outcome, right? Just to be able, to enter into the other side and be with them and what they're going through, whether you think it's reality or not. Like, they feel it and experience it as reality sometimes. So to be able to be with them in that and kind of walk with them, and then that way you're getting what you want. And one of the coolest things I feel like that was said to me most recently, along the vein of the book in counseling and psychology, is called polyvagal theory, is kind of what the book's based in. But a lady that's like really big in that, Deb Dana, she's amazing. And she told me, she was like, they need to feel safe enough to do what you're asking them to do. And a lot of times we're just, as coaches or as parents, trying to just tell them logistical things. You need to do your homework. You need to do this. You need to do that. And it's like, they're not in a place to really receive that or do that a lot of times. And again, they come across maybe as unwilling or unmotivated, but maybe they're just biologically unavailable. Maybe they're just not really there. So can we prioritize regulation over information, get them into that connection mode, and then both parties are, winning more? And you got to give a little. That's for sure.
Absolutely. That's a great way to finish up there. David, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. I loved it. It was a great conversation, and maybe we'll have a chance to do it again sometime.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was awesome. Always love talking about this stuff. So yeah, thank you. And stoked to hear from people. Would love for them to reach out if they want to talk more about this stuff.
Fantastic. Thanks, David. So, what's your biggest takeaway from my conversation with David Durand? My biggest takeaway from this episode relates to what sustainable confidence really looks like. Many young athletes think confidence is about not being nervous or having an unshakable belief in their abilities. However, David and I argue that confidence is about having a stable sense of identity and knowing who you are as a person. Being clear on personal values can help young athletes absorb scrutiny from outside influences like social media. However, it can take work to develop those values. That's where mental performance coaches come in. I want to thank David for joining me on the podcast. You can learn more about David by visiting his website at realdevelopment.org. To learn how mental performance coaching can help young athletes become confident problem solvers in sport and life, visit michaelvhuber.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you back soon for episode 79.
Mike Huber is the founder and owner of Follow the Ball Coaching, located in Fairhaven, New Jersey. He is a mental performance coach and business advisor dedicated to serving athletes just like you reach their full potential on and off the court. The Freshman Foundation is all about helping you get to the next level. For more information, follow along on Instagram Freshman Foundation. Please subscribe, give us a like on iTunes, Spotify, leave a review, tell a friend. Most importantly, come back in 2 weeks, ready to get better.